The next assembly we're going to discuss is Buckner. And Buckner, no longer producing backflow prevention assemblies, although the company's still in business, produced backflow assemblies from about 1990 to about 1994. They produced a 24,000 series, which was a reduced pressure assembly, a 24,100 series, which was a double check assembly, and a 24,200 series, which was a pressure vacuum breaker. They produced assemblies in sizes 3/4 or 2 inch, the smaller sizes. The reason it says series on this is because each model number was different for each size. In other words, on the RP series, a 3/4 inch was a model 24,000, a 1 inch was a model 24,001, and so forth. So it was confusing. Sometimes you'd see different model numbers on paperwork and or assemblies and not clear why there was a difference between them. The assembly was very similar in appearance to the BAVCO Model 825Y. In fact, once upon a time in history, the company called Johns Manville owned both Buckner and BAVCO. And there was some commingling of engineers and products and patents and things like that. And that's one of the reasons Buckner was able to produce this assembly for this period. And as I said, it was very similar in construction to the 825Y, with the Y pattern poppet style checks out the top and the second check out the bottom and relief valve off to the side. Almost the same basic construction as we saw in the 825Y. The 24,100 series double check was very similar in construction to the BAVCO 805Y. Again, same reasoning that was used in the earlier version of the RP, why it was similar in construction. Poppet style checks, inlet outlet checks, open and down at a 45-degree angle. Glued-on check covers, check spring, disc holders, seat, and did have replaceable check seats. The pressure vacuum breaker, the 24,200 series, was very similar in construction to the BAVCO Model 765, and there were some basic parts difference between the 1/2, 3/4, and 1 inch design and the 1 1/4 or 2 inch design. I'm showing you these assemblies as a footnote valve because parts are no longer available for any of these, double check, RP, or PVB. After Buckner discontinued production of these assemblies, they made parts for a short time afterwards, but the parts have all been out of production now, and hardware and software parts are no longer available. But I just want to show you what they look like. Let's go ahead and look at them on the table. Here's the 24,000 series, having to be a 3/4 inch, and the double check version looks just like the 805Y, as we said. Same poppet style check designs as we saw earlier. And here's a cutaway of the relief valve, showing you that same basic O-ring stem design of relief valve. Pressure vacuum breaker, very similar to the 765 series, as I mentioned. And showing you the canopy from the top. That same 1/8 turn rotation, 1/4 turn rotation of the spring retainer check assembly. But there are no more rubber parts available for any of these models, so basically if you have run across them, I'm afraid you're going to have to replace them. And that's the Buckner series of backflow assemblies produced from about 1990 to about 1994. The next manufacturer we're going to discuss is Clayval. Clayval is a manufacturer been making backflow assemblies from the mid-50s up till about 2006, around there. They've discontinued production of their backflow prevention assemblies. They are available after 2006 on special order only, but it's not a regular production unit like it was before then. This one we're going to do a little differently. We're going to talk about the different check modules, the different relief valve modules, and then plug them back into the specific models. So we'll talk about the RPs first, and we'll talk about the flanged sizes first, meaning the large 2.5 through 10. Although in the Clayval world, 2 inch was a flanged unit, so 2 inch through 10 inch. The original RP model was what was called a Model RP, as the name implies, and was produced from about 1958 to about 1978. And the 2 inch happened to be a bronze body unit, but the 2.5 through 10 inch were a fused epoxy coated cast iron body. Check seats were replaceable, threaded into the body. The check seat had to have a special tool to be properly changed. The check mechanism is what was called a 3081 toggle lever check. Clayval in the large flanged sizes produced a 3081 and a 3084 toggle lever check. And the 3081 and 3084 are very similar in construction. And here's a view from the top, and here's a cutaway view of the side. Cover came off from the top. Spring was loaded from the very center. It utilized a toggle design where there was a spindle here and a spindle there that it rotated on. The check assembly would be in the water passageway, and as the water demand came, it pivoted straight up, compressing that check spring into the cover. So this is the 3081 design. What was different on the 3084 had to do with the check disc retainer, and the check disc guide, which they did change. And we'll talk about that when we take the check assemblies apart. So 308-1 style check, 308-4 style check are the check mechanisms used in the large, meaning 2-inch through 10-inch flanged assemblies. This was in the Model RP, as we just discussed, which was produced from 1958 to 1978. In the oldest version, the Model RP utilized a relief valve assembly that was called a CDHS-14. Clay valve in their large flanged assemblies, again 2 through 10 inch, had 3 different relief valves they used over the years: the CDHS-14, the CDHS-20, and the CDHS-24. This being the Model RP, the oldest version, utilized the CDHS-14 relief valve. The CDHS-14 relief valve had 2 external relief valve sensing lines. The CDHS-14 relief valve, again used on the Model RP, had, and here's a picture of the relief valve body, the relief valve seat which screwed in from the body, relief valve disc holder, relief valve stem. They utilized 3 rolling diaphragms, a small lower one, an upper and lower rolling diaphragm, and the pistons that held the relief valve together. Relief valve spring was mounted on the top. Cover comes off the top like this. This is a picture of the 1 and 1 1/4 inch design, which was used on the 2 and 2 1/2 inch. The 3 inch utilized 1 1/4 inch CDHS-14, and the 4 through 10 inch used a 2 inch CDHS-14. Clay valve has discontinued production of the rubber repair parts on the CDHS-14 for the small 1 inch CDHS-14 and the 1 1/4 CDHS-14. They're only producing rubber parts for the 2 inch CDHS-14, which fits on the model's 4 through 10 inch Model RP. The Model RP was made from 1958 to 78, but the Model RP1 was the next revision of this particular unit, and they had up to a Model RP4 revision, which we'll talk about. The RP1 was produced in sizes 2 through 10 inch and produced from about 1978 to about 1990. There was a Model RP1 where the relief valve was mounted on the side of the check body that you see here. It's that same 308-1 check design, but the relief valve that they utilized was a CDHS-20. When you're ordering parts for the Model RP and the RP1, it was critical that you had the serial number of the unit. And there is a serial number tag right here that I want to show you what it looks like. Because what you would always see was the model number on the left-hand side of the cover, of the tag like this. Then there would be a stock number on the top. And then underneath would be the serial number. It would be an alphanumeric sequence, 2 letters and then 1, 2, or 3 numbers. So this is the tag, usually on the number 2 check. There's the model. There's a stock number, which we don't need, but the serial number was critical, the alphanumeric sequence of that particular assembly to order the right repair parts for the checks. There was an RP1EX that was produced, and the EX designation had to do with the location of the relief valve. Remember, in the RP1 series, it was bolted on the side of the number 1 check valve. But what they did on the RP1EX series is they mounted the relief valve underneath the first check by having a flange on the bottom of the body and an elbow coming down the mount of the relief valve below the number 1 check body. So RP1, the CDHS-20 relief valve was mounted on the side. RP1EX, the CDHS-20 relief valve was mounted by a nipple and flange configuration underneath the check body. Same 308-1 style check as we saw in the RP series, but the rubber parts were changed and serial number was necessary to determine which parts you needed the right serial numbers to order the right repair parts. So here's that same toggle lever check design, the 308-1 that we saw in the Model RP, which is used in the RP1. Same check cover on the top, spring in the center, 2 pins here that have to be driven out to remove the toggle lever check out of the body. Same check mechanisms in the RP and RP1X. Again, different rubber parts could be needed, but you need the serial number to tell which one you had. The relief valve that was used in the RP1 and the RP1EX model was called a CDHS-20. CDHS-20 relief valve was different than the CDHS-14. A little simpler in construction, had a single external relief valve sensing line versus 2 we saw on the CDHS-14. Relief valve body on the bottom, relief valve seat screwed in right here, relief valve spring. We had our diaphragm retainer, relief valve disc, and we had an upper rolling diaphragm which helped act as a guide of the movement of that relief valve. So the CDHS-20 was used on the RP1 and the RP1EX series. The CDHS-20 came in 3 different sizes. The 3/4 inch CDHS-20 fit sizes 3/4 through 1.5 RP2, which we'll talk about in a minute. The 1 1/4 CDHS-20 fit 2 through 3 inch model RP1 and RP1EX. and the 2-inch CDHS-20 fit on the relief valve on models 4 through 10-inch model RP1 and RP1EX. So although the size would be different and larger on the larger sizes, the construction was basically the same, with the relief valve seat, spring, diaphragm stem assembly, and the rolling diaphragm on the top, which operated as a guide. The RP1 was produced, as I say, from 1978 to about 90, and in 1991 they introduced the model RP4 series, and that was produced up till about 04, 05 when they discontinued production of these assemblies. They're on special order only now. But the RP4 was different than the RP1 in that it utilized a new style of check mechanism called the 3084 toggle lever check, and it utilized a new type of relief valve called a CDHS-24 relief valve. Externally, there was no difference between the check bodies in the 301 and 3084. The internal parts that were different were the disc retainer, and the disc guide. The CDHS-24 relief valve did appear slightly different on the outside. It had a lower throat on the bottom of the relief valve, which we'll show you on the next picture. Here's the breakdown of the 3084. You can see the basic check design looking from the side, almost indiscernible to see the difference. But between the disc holder, and the disc retainer, there were some changes, which made it a little easier on the repair process. But it's the basic same toggle lever check design with the 2 pins holding the check assembly here, the spring mounted the middle cover from the top to remove that. The CDHS-24 relief valve, again, the bottom portion had a much deeper throat area down here than the CDHS-20, which was more flat in its appearance. What was different inside the body was the relief valve disc holder and the stem, and there was a couple other little parts inside, which we'll show you when we take it apart. But it had basically same construction as the CDHS-20, just slightly different disc holder and some other parts inside on that relief valve stem in the CDHS-24. And that was used in the model RP4 from 1991 to 2005. They did produce one model of RP in the smaller, meaning smaller than 2-inch, in the 3/4 through 1.5 inch sizes, and the RP2 series was produced from about 1978 to about 2003. And it was a poppet style check, not the toggle lever check as we saw in the flanged units. And it utilized the same relief valve, the CDHS-20, that we saw in the model RP1. The check mechanism used in the RP2 series, the 3/4 through 1.5 inch, utilized a poppet style check. Similar to what we've seen from several other designs, there was a bolted in check cover. When the cover comes off, there would be an uncontained check spring underneath. And the check assembly disc holder would either be made out of Delrin, which is a type of plastic, the Delrin check assembly, or there was a stainless steel version, which had a stainless steel disc holder version. Either version was made over the years. Rubber parts fit both versions. But of the check assembly that was used in the 3/4 through 1.5 inch poppet style check, there were 2 versions: a plastic disc holder made out of a plastic called Delrin, or a stainless steel version. The relief valve used in the RP2 series was the CDHS-20, same relief valve used in the model RP1 and RP1EXs, except that it was the smaller version, meaning the 3/4 inch CDHS-20, and this fit size is 3/4 through 1.5 inch. Same basic construction as we saw in the RP1. Relief body in the bottom, relief valve seat threads into there, relief spring, our disc holder, diaphragm, and the upper rolling diaphragm, which acts as a guide, which we'll take apart in a few minutes. So the RP, which was produced from 58 to 78, has the 3081 style check assembly with the CDHS-14 relief valve. The RP1 and RP1EX series were produced from 1978 to about 1990. Utilizing the 3081 check style with the CDHS-20 relief valve. And then in 1991 they introduced the RP4 series, which utilized the 3084 toggle style check with the CDHS relief valve. They did produce a small RP, small meaning 3/4 through 1.5 inch, called the model RP2, which utilized a poppet style check as opposed to the toggle lever style check, and utilized the same CDHS-20 as used on the RP1. We'll take all these apart and look at those individual parts separately. In the RP world, Clayval did make a reduced pressure detector assembly called the Model 18, which utilized the RP1 series. They made a Model 18-4, which utilized the RP4 series. And the RP2 was used as the bypass on the Model 18. On the Model 18-4, they had several different bypasses they used over the years. Always check the serial number tag on the bypass to make sure you have the right repair parts. And that's the RPs produced by Clayval. In the Clayval world, the double check series were known as the Model D, or double check. The Model D and DEX versions were produced from mid-50s, 1958 to about 1990. Again, same toggle lever, 3081 toggle lever check design as we saw in the RP and the RP1. The Model D was produced in sizes 2.5 through 10, cast iron body, fused epoxy coated, single access cover from the top, got the access to the checks. There were the plugs on the side that had to be removed, 4 for each check. You see 2 here, 2 there, and then 2 on the back side and 2 on the back side here. That had to drive the pins out for the proper repair. The same 308-1 toggle lever check was used in the D and the DEX series. And again, the 2 pins here drive out, toggle lever comes out from the top, changing the check disc. Was a matter of changing the bolt or several washers, which we'll talk about in the different sizes. The D4 series began around 1991. On the outside, it looked very similar to the Model D. The difference was the check mechanism inside was no longer the 308-1 check toggle lever check, but now they were utilizing the 308-4 toggle lever check, which we discussed a minute ago with the RP4 series. In the 308-1-4 check, they changed the disc retainer, and the disc retainer guide. And the 308-4 toggle lever check, again, looked identical, just small differences in parts inside that assembly, and that was used on the Model D4. Clayval did produce a double check detector assembly using those same basic check mechanisms in the Model D and the D4. They had a Model 16 which used the 308-1 check style design, and a Model 16-4 which used the 308-4 model check design. Anytime you see that Model 4 in that designation, that's telling you that it's got the new style or the newer style 308-4 toggle lever versus the 308-1 toggle lever check. So double check detector assemblies were the Model 16 series, came in the Model 16 or 16-4. Model 16 production began in late 70s, early 80s, when it was discontinued up till 1990. They made the 16, and then in 1990 they switched to the 16-4 series, and the whole assembly was discontinued around 2003. Clayval also produced a Model 27 series, the 27 and a 27-4. What that was a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker. In other words, the 27 used the 308-1 style check, the 27-4 used the 308-4 style check, just as we saw in the Model D double check series. But what was unique was this air inlet valve that was mounted on the downside of the number 2 check. By placing a vacuum breaker inlet on the downside of the number 2 check, it gave them the ability to operate as a pressure vacuum breaker. Most pressure vacuum breakers are sizes 1/2 through 2 inch, and they tend to be a brass body angle type construction. But for larger sizes, there was some concern or demand for a double check in larger sizes, so an RP didn't have to be installed. So several manufacturers, Clayval being one of them, did produce a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker where they took their standard double check, and by mounting an air inlet on the downside, gave it the ability to operate as a 2-check PVB. Production on this began about 1970 and was discontinued about 1990-ish. The air inlet, as you see right here, just mounted on the end. It was strictly an air inlet, spring-loaded to have a minimum 1-pound loading like a pressure vacuum breaker. And that's the larger sizes, meaning 2-inch through 10-inch, 308-1 and 308-4 type of checks used in the Model D and the Model D4, and also used in the Model 16 double-check detector assembly and the Model 27 2-check pressure vacuum breaker. They did produce a Model D2 double-check in the small sizes, meaning 3/4 through 1.5 inches. And it was a bronze body construction with a poppet style check. Here's a picture of what the valve looked like and a kind of a cutaway on the schematic of what it looked like inside the assembly. So in the D2 series, again 3/4 or 1.5 inches, that poppet style check that we discussed could have the Delrin check disc holders or the stainless steel disc holders. Were produced over the years and could have either one of those versions in there. There was one Model D series that utilized the 308-1 check in the small sizes, meaning 3/4 through 1.5 inches, which we'll show you as a footnote. But the majority of the small assemblies were the poppet style check, and those were started around 1978. But before 78, around 75-ish, they did make a small, meaning 3/4 or 1.5 inches 308-1 check, but it wasn't made for very long. And I'll show that to you when we get the assemblies part. So those are all the Model double checks, RPs, double check detector assemblies, RP detector assemblies, and the 2-check pressure vacuum breaker produced by Clayval. So let's take a look at the 308-1 check, the 308-4 check, and the 3 relief valves, the CDHS-14, CDHS-20, and CDHS-24. Okay, in the Clayval world, talk about the individual check assemblies, the 308-1 and 308-4. I've got one check body here. This happens to be a 308-1 style, but I'm going to show you the differences in the 308-4 as we go through it. First, you'll notice that this has the mounting on the side. This was the first check of a Model RP1. Again, the relief valve mounted on the side, the CDHS-20. If it was a Model RP, which would have used the same basic configuration, the CDHS-14 relief would have mounted on the side. The RP1EX had this flange under the bottom, pointing straight down here on the EX series. The 308-1 toggle lever check and 308-4 toggle lever check, the check and the body are very similar, almost identical. Some slight differences in how it was built. Trying to give you an idea of what this body looks like. Inside this assembly, there is 2 pins that slide through here, and what sits in those 2 pins is this check mechanism, just like this. So that's what it looks like. So let's go ahead and take it apart and see inside what it's going to look like. First thing, body and the cover are made of cast iron infused epoxy coated. Now the air bleed was on the top of the check cover. And unfortunately, because it was the air bleed, there were a lot of times where the threads would start deteriorating, or what was called carbonization, where the strength of the metal was gone. And sometimes, unfortunately, like this one, the plug would literally blow right out of the cover. And the covers had to be replaced sometimes because of using that plug as a release in the air, caused some problems with the threads corroding. Once the cover comes off, what you're going to see is this, our check spring, which just comes out loosely. But now you can see that toggle lever check. And you can see the movement of that check assembly, okay? So what you're seeing, again, is this. The check sits just like that inside the body. Spring sits here, which is pushed down from the cover. As a demand for water happens, the check assembly pulls up, compressing the spring into the cover, and back down just like that. It's the toggle lever check. Now to get the check out of the body, we have 4 plugs, 2 here and 2 on the back side that we're going to have to remove. Remove our 4 plugs. This. Now we have to drive these 2 pins out. Now the stainless steel pins look like this inside there. So what you want to do is get a pin that has a similar diameter than that one, because you don't want to damage it. So go ahead and find yourself the proper size rod. Pushing the spring retainer out from the back side. Pin comes out here. Now when you get to the front half, in other words here where the seat portion is, you want to hang on to this part, which is the spring retainer knob, and the clamp right here. Because as you push that spindle out, you want to hang on to it. Pull your spindle out, still keeping hold of the valve. The reason is, if you let go of this, it could fall down inside the body. If it fell like that, this check seat is right here, you could have just damaged it. So hang on to it till you get that last spindle out, and then pull the check assembly out from the top. So let's review what that check assembly looks like inside the body. Mount it out here so you can see. So the movement of that check mechanism is like this. As the demand for water, check assembly moves up and down just like that. Okay? Spring sits here. As demand for water causes it to open, it compresses the spring into the cover, going straight up, just like that. Kind of unique. It's called a toggle lever check design, unique to Clayval. And this is the design they've used in their assemblies for basically all of the production, including the 3084 design, which is very similar to this, except some minor changes, which I'll show you. As I mentioned, the 3/4 through 1.5 inch utilizes a poppet style check, but they did use a 3081 style check on the small sizes, 3/4 through 1.5 inch, in the early 70s. As you can see, it's the exact same toggle lever mechanism, except small. Was not used very much, not sold very many. A little complicated for a relatively small 3/4 double check, and cost-wise it was a lot more money, so they came up with the poppet style, which was more common for the market at that time. But this is what it did look like, a very small, meaning 3/4 inch 3081 style check assembly. Back to this. There's several things we have to look at on this body. So before we start taking the rubber parts out of it, let's take a look at the check body itself. First, it is fused epoxy coated, so theoretically we're not going to have too much problems with the body. But I want to show you the check seat on this body. Because the check seat that you see right here is not flat. In fact, you look at it, it appears to be flat. It has a small 5-degree taper, and the taper is sharper in the center and smaller on the outside diameter. That check seat sits inside there and has a small taper on it because the way that this disc sits on top of here gives it a small mechanical advantage by being a rise in the center of the seat. So a lot of times when people go to surface this seat or polish it, they'll take sandpaper in there, which you never want to put on a seat, as we've said, and they get in there and they start sanding it down and actually removing that small, very minor 5-degree taper. So make sure you know that that taper has to stay on the seat just like that. The seat on the RP actually had a long sleeve on it like this. Here's the seat that you can see. If I show you the inlet side of that seat, you'll see this. So what you're looking at is this. In other words, that seat threads into the body and it leaves this area here where there's a gap between the seat and the body itself. This is what's called a quiet zone, or zone of quiescence, as Clavel called it. And the purpose of that area in here is that's where the sensing lines for your high pressure sensing line came through. In other words, the nipple came through the side of the body right here. And that nipple, like this, would attach to the side with a fitting that would go to our high pressure sensing line. Well, because of the movement of this check assembly, you can see it's a relatively unobstructed passageway. They had a tremendous amount of velocity that could go through that valve with that check assembly opened wide open. And what happened is the water would travel so fast that it could literally siphon the water off of that nipple on the side right there. And if it siphoned the water as it went past this nipple, it would take the high pressure off of the relief valve and cause the relief valve to open up. So to quiet down the pressure in that area, what they did is they put a seat that had these little holes all the way around it like this one inside there. And you can see those corresponding holes here and here. Okay? So the seat is sitting in like this. The nipple protrudes through the side just like this. The high pressure water would come through here. Now, as you can see, that nipple would plug up quite regularly because it's still screwed into a cast iron body. So part of the repair process was cleaning this area around the seat between the outside diameter of the seat and the inside diameter of the body. Again, there's usually a gate valve bolted up here, so you can't get in it like this, as you can see like I can. You're dropping the body down and seeing very easy to see. What you had to do was clean it from the inside. I know at the swap meets a lot of people have the small little dental picks, or you could get a small little pen screwdriver, something in there to clean out those little holes. What was advisable was to take the old nipple off like this and clean it out, remove the brass, put it back in. Once you had it back in, go to your number 1 test cock, bring the water from your number 1 test cock and push it into this fitting. Now, with the water shooting in here, you could see which of the holes were opened and which weren't. And again, the small dental picks were very good for getting in here that you can pick up at the swap meets to get in and clean out those little holes. If you could not get water coming out of those holes, yes, you may have to drop the body in again and clean it here, but that was extremely rare. But most of them you could clean out just by picking it through the hole because that's where it tended to calcify at the spot was where that hole was. Now again, this is what the check seat looks on the RPs on the first check. The double checks, the second check, the RP4s, and some of the RP1EXs did not have this quiet zone. They just had the flat, regular check seat like this. You can tell by looking in on the first check, if it's got those holes like that, that it's going to be one of the sleeved check seats. Okay, so that's the check body. Cleaning out those holes are critical to the working of that particular check, especially that nipple that goes into where the relief valve sensing line comes in. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at our check mechanism. We saw how it works, that toggle lever design, as I say. To rebuild the check was very simple. Remove one bolt. Underneath the bolt would be an O-ring, right there. Our disc retainer. Underneath there you would see one of possible 3 washers. You may see 2 grays and 1 red, or some combination of those 3. And then a check disc, which comes out of the disc holder, just like this. Okay? So those are the parts in the check mechanism. Now, each of them has some interesting things we have to be aware of. First thing we'll talk about is the check mechanism itself. You'll notice that the toggle lever check has 2 pins, yoke arm, cam arms, and it has to move easily back and forth. So the first thing you want to do is moving it, making sure you have easy motion of that check assembly. The next thing you want to look at are the E-rings on the side that hold this check together. If you look right here, you'll see those E-rings, which we talked about earlier. That's what holds that check assembly together. That E-rings do come in the rubber repair kit and maybe have to be replaced because sometimes, like this one, they're missing. Or like this version here, which was one of the very oldest ones, they actually used a small rubber O-ring to hold that clapper assembly together. Most of those have come apart by now because the movement of that check assembly caused enough action that it caused those O-rings to break after a while. And like the one here, it would be missing just like this. But if you've got the steel ones like this, at that point, as long as you have good movement, you're fine. Now I say as long as you have good movement, you want to make sure that your movement is good, moving easily, and the parts are true. Notice this one, here's the yoke arm, which is up here, except this is obviously a much larger one. This is off an 8-inch. Notice that that yoke arm has been completely damaged. See how it's worn off to the side here? So that's what you've got to inspect for. So if you have restriction on your movement, now you're going to break it down, inspect each of these linkages separately. And sometimes you may find something like this, where out of the larger one where it's damaged, and you may have to replace that piece of the check mechanism. Assuming you have good movement, check your E-rings, your E-clips to make sure they're holding the check assembly back together. And that's all you've got to do with the bottom section. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was critical to have the serial number when you order the assemblies, because the serial number tells us what type of check disc you're going to have in there. This is the oldest version, used in the original 3081. Here's the modified version, used in the 3081. And here's the check disc in the 3084. These are all 4-inch check discs, but you'll notice they're all dramatically different in size and are not interchangeable. So if you do not have that serial number and the correct model number, you may get the incorrect repair part. So make sure you've got the right model, the right serial number when you order parts. Now, when you go to put the check disc back in, it fits back into the disc holder. But remember I said it was fun, you're going to find 1, 2, or 3 of these little washers in here? When you buy a rubber repair kit, you're going to get all 3, just like this. The purpose of these washers is to take up the tolerances of this disc in relationship to the disc holder. This check design is unique because it has that 5-degree taper on that seat, like I mentioned to you. And that 5-degree taper is very critical for the function of this valve.